Hello, everyone. This is Gilgamesh. And today we're going to tackle the second part of chapter 7 of Isaiah. We're going to talk about the second of the wonderful children, famously known as Immanuel. So let's get into it. Last episode, we talked about the first wonderful child, which was Yashuv. We talked about some of the background history that was happening at this point so you could understand the political situation that this was a reaction to. We also talked about some of the archaeological discoveries, which place a lot of this in context, and there is a lot of archaeological discoveries that bring together what the biblical story has and what we have been able to discover, including things that we have discovered in the last decade. This episode, we're going to move on to the next part of the chapter. We're going to cover, verses 10 through the end of the chapter in this session, but we're going to talk about a couple of things here that I think are important to understand the verses that we're coming to here, the second wonderful child and its place in history. And one of the things we're going to talk about is the Christian importance of this verse and how it can be understood as a Pesher. We're going to give some sources also that will help anyone who's interested in seeing a scholarly approach to how this verse plays in context and what we have seen as far as similar prophecies in surrounding cultures to this situation. But then we're also going to talk about the actual sign, the actual child Emmanuel. We're going to talk a little bit about butter and honey and what that means and what that had to do with things. And we're going to talk about the Assyrian invasion. To do this, I want to set some goals clear for everybody about this channel. I am hoping that this series is available to people of all faiths and no faiths. I'm trying to make this very accessible. It is not my intention to push a particular religious viewpoint, Christian or otherwise, on anyone. My goals here I set out in these bullet points. I want to increase awareness and appreciation of the Hebrew Bible generally. I want to talk about how beautiful its language is and how timeless its themes are. I want to explain what we know about the Hebrew Bible from archaeology and history, and from that perspective particularly. There are a lot of choices out there of things to watch on YouTube and around the internet, and there is plenty covering other perspectives. I want this channel grounded very firmly in history and archaeology. It's where I have the most joy and the most experience, and so it is what I tend to focus on. That is not to diminish anyone else's view, regardless of how they base it. I do want to talk about how the text has a continuing impact on culture and art. I don't think we can talk about something like Isaiah without discussing how it influenced artists like George Frederick Handel, and things that I've shared already with artistic works around beating swords into plowshares and portraying the garden of the Lord and all of the different things that we see imagery-wise in Isaiah. This has had a huge impact on our culture, on Jewish, Christian, and even secular situations. And I think that is an important part of understanding the importance of the text. And so I'm going to continue to bring up those issues. And I'm going to try and keep the information here high quality and well researched. I'm trying to avoid anything which is overly speculative or based purely on faith positions. And I want to give people enough room to form their own interpretations around the text, because I think that's an important part of how we engage with the text, is we understand its historical context and its timeless appeal, and then we form our own opinions around it. So that being said, I want to address the elephant in the room, which is the importance of this second wonderful child to Christianity and how that should be understood, and how I'm going to discuss it in this episode. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, we have a type of document that we call a Pesher. And this here that you see is an example of the Isaiah Pesher. This is 4Q Isaiah Pesher B, or 4Q 162. If you're trying to look up this actual fragment, that's how you will identify it. It means that it's from Cave 4 in Qumran. And what this does is this goes through particularly Isaiah chapter 5, which I've already covered here, and it goes through verse by verse and lays out what Isaiah said and then gives the Pesher or meaning of that verse. And when it does so, it applies it to the author's time and place and not to Isaiah's time and place. So it largely ignores the context in which the text was actually written and sees in the text something that can apply to its own particular time, place, and circumstance. This was an early type of Jewish interpretation. Now, I do want to be clear, mainstream Judaism does not use the term Pesher to describe its type of interpretation. They do use other terms like Midrash and Agada, but this is something particularly we see in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and that is important because the Dead Sea Scrolls are roughly contemporary with the Christian New Testament. And so what was popular among them could reflect very clearly on what would have been popular among Jewish Christian authors in that first century CE, and probably reflects very well the type of approach they would have to the scriptures. And this approach is Jewish interpretation. These were Jews that wrote these Peshers, but it is not far into mainstream Jewish interpretation either, because the idea that the text itself can be understood at multiple levels is something that is baked into the text itself. And we'll actually see some examples of this in the verses today, where Isaiah will speak of one thing, and he is clearly using it as a symbol or a stand-in for something else. And because he does this, there is always the question of, what is he really talking about? What are these various things that he's putting in his text symbols or stand-ins for? Now, the thing with the Pesher is it's sort of beyond any type of scholarly debate or interpretation, because your belief in a Pesher has to do with your belief in the person giving it. Because it's not based on any clear interpretation of the text or any grounded meaning in context, it is based purely on the interpretive abilities of the person creating it. And so in this Pesher that we see on the screen here, the people of the Qumran community felt that the priests in Jerusalem were wicked, and so it looked at Isaiah 5 and the consequences and judgments that came in Isaiah 5 and said, this applies to the priests at Jerusalem. And so they took the text that was centuries old at their point and applied it to their day and their circumstance, because they felt that was the appropriate interpretation. And their ability to do so is largely resting on the respect and authority that they had to make that kind of adjustment, to apply the scripture to their day and time. When we come to the Christian understanding of Emmanuel, it all sort of hinges on this one spot in the book of Matthew. Matthew quotes Isaiah and says, and all this took place to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by his prophet. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall call his name Immanuel, which means God with us. In the book of Matthew, this is described as being given to Joseph in a dream. This is best understood as a Pesher. Matthew is not trying to say that this is what Isaiah meant when he talked about Emmanuel in his text. What he is trying to say is he sees connections between this verse and what he perceives to be happening in his time and place. And so he is saying there is a connection to this ancient text to his current circumstance, and that's how he applies it. And so when we see a lot of Christians and Jews arguing over who was Emmanuel, the argument is pointless, because Matthew was really not trying to invalidate any original meaning of this text. He was simply trying to apply the text to what he felt was a great and significant event. Mark Twain is credited with saying that history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And this is kind of what Matthew's position was, is once long ago, there was a very important child who was born who would save Israel and show them that God was with them. That, in his view, is happening again. And this is what he talks about when he says fulfill. And there are a lot of great Christian scholars out there that will look at this word fulfill and will give very detailed ideas of what that word actually means. Matthew is distinct in his formation of these fulfillment citations. There are at least 10 Peshers given by Matthew throughout his text. I say at least 10 because there's some disagreement as to what counts as them and so forth, but there's at least 10. He's clearly influenced by the Septuagint in his citation of scripture, particularly in this one where the word Alma is translated into the Septuagint as Parthenos, which means virgin. He quotes Isaiah 9 times. So he is very interested in Isaiah, particularly in his idea of applying scriptures to what he sees as important in his time. Now, he quotes from the Hebrew Bible in general over 60 times. There are even some theories that Matthew might have originally composed his text in Hebrew, although that is speculative. It's not without some foundation. But he has this unique thing of quoting scriptures that seem to be completely out of context and saying, here's where it was fulfilled. And what he's meaning by this is that this scripture, in his mind, applies to his day and his circumstance and illustrates the thing that is happening then and there with him. This is the only one of the four wonderful children that Matthew will say anything about, or that the New Testament in general will say anything about. The fourth wonderful child, which is often associated in Christianity with Jesus of Nazareth, is never indicated in the New Testament as being about him. That's a post-biblical innovation. So this is the only time that Matthew tries to associate one of these children with Jesus of Nazareth, and he does so in this one spot, and this is the only spot where this happens. And it's important to understand how he did that and what he was saying was happening there. As we go through this, I'm not going to try with this and other verses to try and explain the Christian significance of these verses, because I want this to be a much more universal approach to the book of Isaiah. But I did want to explain a little bit in general why I am not going to be doing that, and to get an idea across of what it seems to be that the Christian authors are doing, because arguing over this is really pointless. This is how Matthew saw the events of his day and how he saw scripture reflecting that. Trying to prove or disprove an identity in this text does not have any effect on Matthew's interpretation or use of this text, and should threaten no one who does not value Matthew's opinion, nor should it prove anything if you do value Matthew's opinion. It is simply his application to what he sees as important in his day. That being said, I did say that I wanted to bring out some of the cultural significance, and one of those is one of the most haunting melodies of any Christmas hymn is O Come, Emmanuel, a beautiful piece written originally in Latin for Advent and translated into English by Jason Mason Neal and published in Hymns Ancient and Modern back in 1851 in English, which is what you see here. It's just a beautiful setting of the words of Isaiah to music, just to emphasize how important this was and how much it affected our culture and our understanding. As different people interpreted these words in different ways, they would do things to set them to music and put them into art, because there's so much about it that is timeless, that the child Emmanuel was coming to ransom captive Israel. And I think it's important to recognize that as we deal with these ancient texts, that they aren't just words on a page. They really have impacted our society and our art and our culture. All that being said, let's get into the actual texts. We're on verse 10 of chapter 7. We have this beginning here, and again, the Lord spoke to Ahaz. The again portion here, the Hebrew word Yosef, indicates that we have a bit of a break from our previous portion of the chapter. And you must remember that chapter and verse divisions are a post-biblical invention, considerably post-biblical. So there was no concept of where a new chapter starts. You would often indicate that you're telling a new part of the story by a linguistic trick like this here, by saying something like again. And so we're talking about here a separate time that the Lord spoke to Ahaz through the prophet Isaiah. So this does not necessarily have to be chronologically after what just happened. It doesn't have to be a close adjacent in time. We don't know when this was. In fact, my opinion is that this probably reflects something much earlier in Ahaz's life, maybe by several years. And it's placed here next to it because it is also a prophecy about a child being born. And that is why it is significant next to the prophecy involving She'er Yashuv. Now we get this second child prophecy here, and this is happening at some other time. And so the Lord's message here is, ask a sign of the Lord your God. Now, I will say that the Hebrews here are a little bit unusual. You could actually translate this to ask a sign from the people of the Lord your God. It's because it uses the word there, which this translation translates that word as in, meaning with, but it's also possible to translate it as people. So the Hebrew scripture literally ask a sign with the Lord your God, which is kind of an unusual phrasing, but we're going to go with here to ask a sign of the Lord your God. And then we give the instructions here, let it be as deep as Sheol or as high as the heights. Some translations will not have the word Sheol here or the word hell here. This is because the way the Masoretic text, the traditional Hebrew text we have, and what King James goes with on this is that the vowel points are a little bit different. There are two words, Sheol, which means to ask, and Sheol, which means the underworld. And they're spelled exactly the same way in Hebrew. The only way you can tell them apart is with the vowel points. And the vowels were added centuries after the biblical period, many centuries, like maybe 800. The thing is, with the way this verse is structured, with it being parallel and contrasting to as high as the heights, it seems much more logical rather than this being the word ask, it to be the word Sheol. And so it contrasts as deep as hell or as high as heaven. It's expressing the full range of possibilities of what Ahaz could ask for. And I think King James, going with the traditional Hebrew text, has something like ask it of the deeps or something like that, because again, they're translating Sheol as Sha'al, meaning to ask. But I think this is the better, more logical translation of this verse. Let it be as deep as Sheol or as high as the heights. Then as we come forward here, verse 12, but Ahaz said, I will not ask, I will not put the Lord to the test. What seems to be happening here is that Ahaz is actually making a bit of a pious statement. He is actually quoting Deuteronomy 6:16, which says, you shall not put the Lord your God to the test as you tested him at Massah. This would seem like it's a pious answer. In fact, in the New Testament, this is an answer that Jesus gives to Satan. So, I mean, yeah, this is supposed to be the right answer, right? I don't put the Lord to the test. We don't know why, but it's really the wrong answer here. It seems like Ahaz did the right thing, but it clearly does not make Isaiah happy. And so Isaiah's response to him here is, and he said, hear then, O house of David, is it too little for you to weary men that you must weary my God also? So Isaiah is clearly frustrated. It's like, couldn't you just make this simple for me and ask for a sign? And Ahaz is saying, I'm not going to try and test the Lord. Now, I will note that some translations use the word tempt here. That's really not a good translation. The idea is that you're putting the Lord to a test to see if he can really do the thing you're asking for. You're asking for a sign, and you're going to put him to a test to see if he can deliver on that sign. And Ahaz is saying, no, I'm too righteous for that. I'm not going to put the Lord to any kind of a test. But Isaiah doesn't like that answer. Therefore, the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the maiden shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Immanuel. I will note here that the traditional text has the word Adonai here for the master himself will give you a sign, but the Dead Sea Scrolls has the tetragrammaton. And so this probably was another case where, because of the taboo against saying the name was actually removed from the text and replaced with a substitute word. The older text restores the tetragrammaton to this spot here. So I think the better translation is probably, therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Notice here that I have the word maiden for the young woman here. It's a little bit of an old-fashioned word, but it gets the point across here. The Septuagint translates the word here as parthenos. It generally means a virgin, but there are several copies of the Septuagint which have neamis, which means a girl or young woman, and that's probably more accurate. But it was probably from the Septuagint that Matthew got his ideas, and that's what made him connect it to his time and place. But the Hebrew word alma means a young woman and does not really require virginity. In fact, it often refers to a young married woman. The verse also implies that a woman will bear child, and it does not indicate that she's going to remain a virgin through some miraculous manner. The context also seems to demand that this is an immediate thing that is happening to Ahaz and not something that is some far-off future event, but it is something that is going to be a sign to him, particularly in his immediate time frame, and possibly addressing his concerns of the possible invasion of Syria and Ephraim into his territory. This itself doesn't seem like it's intended to be the miracle part. the maiden isn't what's really the miracle about this, but that the miracle is what we're going to see in the coming verses, which is as the child grows, certain things are going to happen. But that a maiden conceiving and bearing a child is really not the big deal here. This is a child that, as the house of David faces destruction, is going to save the people and is going to demonstrate that God is with them. Immanuel, two separate words in Hebrew, but put together as a single proper name, often in English. It is notable that Isaiah mentions the grandness of this sign to be as deep as hell or as high as heaven. And then the thing that he actually gives as a sign is the most small and simple of occurrences. A child is going to be born, but that child is going to overthrow kingdoms. So who is Emmanuel? Well, there are three major possibilities that get floated. One is that he is a child of Isaiah, possibly She'er Yashub, who was just mentioned earlier in the chapter, possibly the child that's going to be mentioned in the next chapter, who has the great name Maher Shalal Chashbaz. But this could be a flashback story to She'er Yashub's birth. And so this, like I said, this doesn't have to be chronologically after what we just read. This may be a flashback, and that could be why this could be She'er Yashub himself being born, and that this is a prophecy of that. The second possibility is that this is a child of Ahaz himself, specifically Hezekiah. This theory has the most support and is the theory that I very heavily favor. Hezekiah fits all the specifics of this prophecy very well, and as we will see, this child mentioned twice in the next chapter, it does seem to imply that this child is one of a royal status and is part of the royal house of David itself. And so Hezekiah fits that nicely. The third possibility is that this is a generic child, and the child could be the child of any of the women at Jerusalem. It says in this theory that there's nothing specific about this child, but that any child that's born at this time is going to be able to fulfill the prophecy because it's about what happens as such a child ages and not the specific child himself. This is a bit weaker because it doesn't say a maiden, it says the maiden. There is a definite article on the word Alma here. And so this seems to be speaking of a specific woman who's going to conceive and bear a son. And so the idea that this is a generic woman, in my opinion, isn't a very strong argument. The idea that this is a child of Isaiah is possible, but I don't think it's nearly as strong as the idea that this is a child in the Davidic line, and really Hezekiah himself, who will have a major part of his life standing up against the king of Assyria. And so I think that is the strongest idea of who Emmanuel is Hezekiah. If you want some good papers on this, here are three great ones, and I will put a link down in the description as well. Cyrus Gordon talks about the use of Alma and brings in the Ugaritic text, where there is an equivalent of both Alma and Batula, which does tend to denote virgin, in a birth announcement in the Ugaritic text. And so just emphasizing that our concepts of virgin and virginity are really not well grounded in this time period, that's not really what these words meant, and that this is a common formation for just simply a birth prophecy in general. There's also Herbert Wolf, who brings some interesting stuff in here, and Gene Rice. Both of those bring some great thoughts and interesting ideas to place this in time and place, and some of their ideas inform some of the things I'm going to talk about here as we go through the rest of the prophecy. So they're really great reads. They're all available for free on JSTOR.org. If you don't know what JSTOR.org is, it is a site where you can sign up for a free account and get access to many scholarly papers. I really recommend reading peer-reviewed scholarly papers when we're dealing with this kind of thing, because a lot of what you find on the internet is kind of weird. Not everybody on YouTube has really researched their stuff, but these are three really good papers that I would recommend. They're all published by credible journals, and they're excellent scholars that have written them. So moving forward here, what else do we know about Emmanuel? Starting in verse 15, he shall eat curds and honey when he knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good. For before the boy knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good, the land whose two kings you dread will be deserted. So we have here a couple of interesting things. We have here the idea of curds and honey. We also have the idea he's going to be of a certain age where he knows how to choose evil versus good. And we say that by that time, the two kings, which almost certainly has to reference Syria and Ephraim, Rezin and Pekah, who were mentioned earlier in the chapter, that they're going to be no more. We know that is happening soon from the time of the last prophecy when they were at the gates of Jerusalem. And so even if this is a flashback, these were things that throughout most of Ahaz's life were a threat to him. And so it makes sense, even if this is a flashback prophecy, that he would be worried about this, and perhaps he was given a sign that before this boy is old enough to know good from evil, these kings will be gone. If this is Isaiah's son, Shear-Yashub, that does then bring a lot of reason to why Shear-Yashub would come with him to the fuller's field to talk to Ahaz about that you don't need to worry about these people at the gate. Remember, here's the kid. That's if it's Shear-Yashub. But we're not sure who it is. And if this is Hezekiah, it also works because Hezekiah was born close to the same time as Shear-Yashub, and it would also be a flashback type thing that perhaps he was told before his child grows old enough to know good from evil, this problem with those two kings is going to be gone. Now, how old is that to know good from evil? Well, nobody's really clear. Some would like to take the Jewish tradition of 12 to 13 being the age of accountability and backdate that. It seems to be that from our best dating techniques, Hezekiah was around 8 or so when the kingdoms fell. And so maybe it's 8. Maybe that's when you know good from evil. Around the time that he knows that is when these two threats to the north are going to be neutralized. And so that is the real sign here, is that the child growing up is going to see the political threat neutralized. Now, what is curds and honey? Well, there is an obvious connection here to the promise that Israel itself would be a land flowing with milk and honey. Curds are clearly a semi-solid milk product of some kind. There's a lot of different translations for the word here. Some include things like a soft cheese like cottage cheese or butter or yogurt. It's not clear exactly what curds were, but every time that the word is used, it does seem to reference a special dish that was highly valued, though perhaps not an expensive dish or one that's exclusively to rich people, but it was something that was very valued. It would seem that the context here and below would seem to be that this food combination should be something representing want or poverty, but there's really no way to make this phrase mean that. Butter and honey was a great thing to have. It wasn't something that you had when you were in dire straits. Famously, Yael gave to Sisera, and when he sought refuge with her, butter and honey, same phrase here, to try and soothe him as he was distressed. It was perhaps not an expensive dish, but definitely a prized dish of some kind. The best explanation I have heard for the way this is used is that these are natural products of the land that do not require agriculture to produce. So when the land to the north largely becomes depopulated, and that would mean that crops and fields are laying fallow, this might still be a food source that exists because it's more naturally produced without agriculture, and that may be why we're talking about curds and honey or butter and honey here. Then the other thing we have to talk about here is the way I translated this. He shall eat curds and honey when he knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good. I translated this in such a way that it seems to indicate that the time that he's going to eat curds and honey is when he's old enough to know good from evil. And I think that fits the context much better. But the Hebrew is ambiguous here, and you will see many translations that translate this as he will eat curds and honey that he might know how to refuse evil and choose good. And I think King James goes with that version there. The idea is that eating curds and honey somehow teaches him the difference between evil and good. Although it's not really clear how that works. This is a prized dish that everybody loves. And so how does that teach you what bitter and evil things are that you should reject? It doesn't really make a lot of sense that way. And given how this phrase is going to recur a little later in the chapter, I think it makes much more sense to say that he'll be eating them when he knows to refuse evil and choose the good. That seems to be a better fit to what's being said here and to make more sense out of the text holistically. As we move on to 17, we have more information about the life of Emmanuel here. The Lord will bring upon you and upon your people and upon your father's house such days as have not come since the day that Ephraim departed from Judah, the king of Assyria. So we have here a couple of levels being brought out. We have you, your people, and your father's house. So you is probably Ahaz, who he's speaking to directly here. Your people would be the people of Judah, and your father's house would be the royal house of David. He's going to bring something that hasn't happened since the kingdom split. And then we have here what's called a gloss, meaning that this might have been added by a later editor to explain what was being meant by this, with the king of Assyria, giving an explanation of what we're talking about is coming. The king of Assyria is coming, and such as has not come since the day that the kingdom was no longer unified. I should note that previously in the chapter, the prophecy was against the northern kingdom, but now this prophecy seems to be against Judah, and this seems to be reflecting now the events that will happen in 701 BC. This is going to be the big confrontation in Hezekiah's life some 20 years later, when Assyria comes up to the very gates of Jerusalem. The earlier part of the chapter seemed to be talking about the two smoking firebrands. That is stuff that is going to happen between 734 and 722 BC. This here that we're talking about of Assyria coming in and invading Judah is going to be placed in around 701 BC, much later in Hezekiah's life. While the whole butter and honey thing seems to be about his boyhood, we're now stepping 20 years later into his adulthood, where he will actually save Judah from Assyria. Moving on to verse 18 here, in that day the Lord will whistle for the fly that is at the end of the streams of Egypt, and for the bee that is in the land of Assyria. So here again, we have the image of whistling. King James Version will give hiss. That's almost certainly a bad translation. This is more whistle. We're pretty sure on that. We don't have here the previous imagery of an ensign being raised in this prophecy, but this still is very clearly connected to chapter 5. And we have here the idea of whistling to draw in these two powers. And we have here both the idea of a fly and a bee. Now, fly, Egypt sometimes stylized itself as a hornet. Perhaps this is the same thing. We're not always clear on what some of these words mean. Bee, the word is Devorah. It definitely means a honeybee. But why these two powers? Why Egypt and Assyria? Because Assyria is what's going to come in, and it's what they just mentioned. So what's Egypt's role in this? Well, there's two thoughts on this. One thought is the possibility that this is a projection far into the future, past Isaiah's lifetime, to the Battle of Megiddo, which will happen in 609 BC, nearly 100 years after the Assyria coming up to the gates of Jerusalem. In that battle, the Egyptians under Pharaoh Necho II will come to the aid of the failing Assyrian Empire against the Babylonians, who are trying to overthrow Assyria. And King Josiah is going to get involved in that and get himself killed by the Egyptians. That's a bit of a stretch. It's well outside of Isaiah's lifetime, well outside of Emmanuel's lifetime. It doesn't seem like it fits well at all for that to be what Egypt's involved in this is. A second possibility, and one that I favor much more, is that this is a more contemporary reference to the growing alliance between the Philistines and the Egyptians of the 25th dynasty, which are led by the Cushite people, and that we are going to see clashes between Egypt and Assyria in the southwest during that 701 BC campaign. We don't get those highlighted as much in the book of Isaiah itself, but that would be much more contemporary with the child Emmanuel, and with what he would see as the king of Assyria comes in is clashes from Egypt with their alliance to the Philistines and Assyria coming in under that 25th Egyptian dynasty. That seems like a more logical interpretation here. Now, the other thing I do want to note on here is I have read everywhere, and I cannot find anyone who supports the idea that either flies or bees respond when you whistle for them. There are actually people who get really caught up on this, that surely they must respond when you whistle. I would love if anyone knows how to get a fly to respond when you whistle for it. Let me know in the comments. Moving on to 19. And they will come, this is the flies and the bees, and settle in the steep ravines and in the clefts of the rocks and on all the thorn bushes and on all the watering places. A couple of words here are a little hard to translate. This word for thorn bushes, it only occurs in Isaiah here and in chapter 55, verse 13. And we think that it might mean the camel thorn bush. I don't know a lot about that bush, but that is one idea of what it might mean. The word for watering places, some people translate it as pastures. we're a little uncertain as to what it means. It might actually be another kind of thorn bush, which if it is, it makes that parallelism a little bit better, that we have steep ravines, clefts of rocks, thorn bushes, and other thorn bushes. So we have a nice little couplets of parallelism if that's the case. But we really don't know a lot about what this means. And we're not really sure exactly what the significance of this is, that these flies and bees are going to come in and settle in these places. But remember, I said that Isaiah talks about things in terms of symbols. And one of the things he uses as symbols a lot is animals and vegetation. And in this case, the flies and the bees he's obviously not talking about literal flies and bees. He was using these as stand-ins for military forces, that they're going to come in. And then what's the significance of them going into these ravines and rocks and thorn bushes? It seems to be that they will be settling in these places that are largely rough and uninhabitable, and that they're going to be covering them. That seems to be what we're getting out of this. But this is, again, the idea that Isaiah isn't speaking in straightforward terms. He is using symbols to stand in for people and other ideas. In this case, he's using them to stand in for the people of Assyria and perhaps Egypt, and they're invading into the land and taking over other places that perhaps are places that are not fully settled. Moving to verse 20, in that day, the master will shave with a razor that is hired beyond the river with the king of Assyria, another gloss, which we think might be added later to explain what this was about, the head and the hair of the feet, and it will sweep away the beard also. This reminds us a lot of chapter 3, where the daughter of Zion is left with her hair cut bald. And it is obviously an act of humiliation. Where in chapter 3, we had the daughter of Zion being used as an imagery of being humiliated and left sitting there without her beautiful hair, we now have it turned to a masculine example here, where your precious beard, your symbol of age and authority, will be just cut off from you, and you'll be left beardless and shaved, sitting on the ground. And so it's interesting because this is a sort of a masculine twist on what we had back in chapter 3. Now, I will point out that why the hair of the feet? It sounds like we're talking about hobbits, but this might be a euphemistic way to refer to pubic hair. And so this might, again, be the idea that this was supposed to be a humiliating process, and that may be what we're talking about here. Nobody knows for sure. It might just simply mean hair of the feet. Hard to say. But the idea here is one of humiliation and being shaved clean. Now, interestingly enough, just like Zion was portrayed as a woman, but it was really referring to a city, this is being portrayed as a man, but it seems to be really referring to the land itself, which we'll see in the coming verse here. Here's 21 through 22. In that day, a man will keep alive a young cow and 2 sheep. And because of the abundance of milk that they give, he will eat curds. For everyone who is left in the land will eat curds and honey. We're back to it. Curds and honey. This seems to be explicitly connected to the land that has just been shaved clean. We're saying that there's going to be a very minimal amount of livestock left. A man will keep a young cow and 2 sheep. That's not a lot of livestock. So he's going to have very little livestock. But then he's going to have an abundance of milk that they'll give, so that he'll be able to make curds. We know curds is a milk product, so yeah, it's tied to that these animals are going to be able to be milked for a lot of milk. Presumably he will be able to find honey. Maybe that has to do with the bees settling everywhere. Everybody who's going to be left is going to be eating curds and honey. So because of the context here, you would expect curds and honey to be something that indicates poverty or want, some type of a distress because of the land being shaved clean. Yet curds and honey was a delicacy dish, and there's going to be an abundance of milk. So it's hard to make complete sense out of this. It does seem, though, that agriculture will be extremely disrupted. Animal husbandry will be greatly reduced, but they will be able to survive on these curds and honey, and that seems to be the message. And so this does fit a lot of what happened in 701 BC, where the Assyrians came through, destroyed a lot of the surrounding areas. Jerusalem was sort of holed up like a bird in a cage. And when the Assyrians miraculously are defeated and leave, they are able to survive on the natural resources of the land, even though much of their agriculture had been destroyed, much of their livestock had been destroyed. They were able to get by. And so, yes, this does lend back into that Immanuel being Hezekiah makes a lot of sense. Then we have the last little bit here on this chapter. In that day, every place where there used to be 1,000 vines worth 1,000 shekels of silver will become briars and thorns. The idea here is that the vineyard, which we've already discussed previously back in chapter 5, that it's going to be destroyed. So a place where there were 1,000 vines, a beautiful vineyard that was worth a whole bunch of money, worth 1,000 shekels of silver, that it's going to become briars and thorns. And these words here have this nice alliteration to them we've mentioned before, which is sha'ir and sha'it, only used in the book of Isaiah. We're not sure exactly what kind of plants they were, but they seem to be clearly some type of a briar or a thorn plant. They're going to be covering the area that used to be the vineyard. And this is another example of Isaiah saying something, but probably meaning something else. One of the reasons why I say that is look at the next line. With arrows and bows, a man will come there, for all the land will be briars and thorns. I don't know about you, but I don't know how to use a bow and arrow against briars and thorns. It does not make any kind of sense. So we have here the idea that the beautiful vineyards are going to become overrun with briars and thorns. And if you go into that area, you're going to need to bring weapons with you because of the briars and the thorns. That clearly seems to indicate that the briars and thorns are something more than just briars and thorns. Just like the bees and the flies meant something else, the briars and thorns must as well. What exactly they mean? It's not clear, and this isn't the last time he's going to reference them. That's actually a nice open question there as to what are the briars and thorns. Then this last verse is actually a little bit of a challenging one to translate. And the mountains that with a hoe are hoed, this is an example of a cognate accusative, something that they love to do in Hebrew here, that you hoe with a hoe, which is where the verb and the direct object come from the same root. And the mountains that with a hoe are hoed, fear of briars and thorns will not come there, and they will become a free range of cattle and where sheep tread. Some of the translation problems here, you have to understand that the second person singular and the feminine third person singular look identical in Hebrew. The verb here could be translated either as you will not come, with no word as its subject, or it can be translated as she will not come, with the word fear as the subject, which is a feminine noun, and so that makes sense. And so it's either saying you will not come to this area for fear of the briars and thorns, or it's saying the fear of the briars and thorns will not come to this area. And I think that the latter makes more sense, though you will see plenty of translations that take either side on this. The idea here is that the mountains, which have always been for the Judahites, their place of refuge, the Harim, the tops of the mountains where the mountain of the Lord's house would be established, all that same word here, these mountains where they are able to form their agriculture, this is their protection. Whatever these briars and thorns are, the fear of them will not come up to the highland mountain area. I think that makes a lot more sense than the other way around, where it's saying that they won't come up to the mountains. That doesn't seem to fit as well here. But that they will become a place where the word here actually means to stretch out, to expand. And the idea is that you turn your cattle loose to graze in these areas, a free range of cattle, and also where the sheep tread through. So they'll be using it for animal husbandry where they used to use agriculture. That all seems to fit with what we've said so far in this chapter. And so the idea here is that their mountain home will be a place where they will survive, and they will be able to take their remaining livestock, turn them loose, feed on them, and perhaps that is why they'll be able to produce the curds and honey that they will survive on. And that's the end of our story of Emmanuel. We know that he's going to be born of a young woman, that before he's old enough to know right from wrong, that the kingdoms of Syria and Israel will be overthrown. And we know that he will be involved with the king of Assyria coming in against Judah and shaving the land clean, putting them in a state of humiliation and poverty. And that during that time, in the aftermath of that, which they will survive, they will be surviving on curds and honey. All of this fits very nicely with Hezekiah. And so Hezekiah was this man from the royal house of David that was born and would live to see Israel under great threat and would allow them to survive to continue on with the house of David. That's our text. If you found this useful, please like and subscribe. Join us on Discord if you'd like to have some conversations on this, or give us some comments down here. Share it with your friends, and we'll see you in the next one.